Hello everyone. We are from group 3. Topic is gender and identity. Is myself, Lilis, Nando, Paula, Nabila, Ayu, and Mila. We present about the topic. In the topic is about gender and interaction. Next slide, please. Let me begin about the definition. Gender is a socially constructed identity rather than a biological category. On the other hand, grammatical gender, which in many languages requires tables and turnips and everything else to be linguistically marked as feminine, masculine, or neuter. As an aside, gender versus sex and contemporary English speakers often use the word gender to mean biological sex. Maybe because we have decided to use the word sex to mean intercourse, and this tendency has spread so far that it's found even in places where there is no possibility of social constructed identity being an issue. For example, some scholarly articles in biology refers to the gender of nesting birds. And the next slide about the interaction. First one, there is a thing called woman's language. It's characterized by an identifiable group in linguistic features. These include hedges, filler, question, increases use of standard language form, and avoidance of interruption. And the third one, these features that I have mentioned before, along with other aspects of women's language, reflect women's generally subordinate role in society power structure. The last one, women's place in society is also indicated by how we use language to talk about women and men. For example, in the next slide, Boyce and Crouch found that at the academic meeting that they studied, that men actually use more tech questions than women. But also point out that some of the tech questions they describe seem to mark antagonistic sparring rather than uncertainty, such as "You would miss it, wouldn't you?" And James and Clark's observation, like Fasol point about the tech question, remind us that there isn't a single thing, interruption, that always does the same in interaction. Conclude, Reed and Greenwood found that men and women actually use features like and question equally of conversation between same-sex pair in France. This suggests the linguistic task on the speaking situation has more effect than the gender of speaker in determining the style of speaking. The second topic is about the difference and dominance. The definition about difference model is the idea that gender differences in language reflect different cultures of conversation. The dominance model is the idea that gender differences in language reflect differences in access to power. Claims that women are more likely to use language to build and maintain relationships, while men are more likely to use language to communicate factual information. Out the volume, sex differentiation in speech is considered a social phenomenon. Unbodied examines sex differentiation in speech cross-culturally isolating variance in pronunciation and forms. As part of speech, terms, titles, and interjection. She gives evidence that sex differentiation can be found in children's voice. She criticized the idea that girls are more fluent than boys. Research which led to that conclusion is held to have inherent methodological problems, lacking in consideration of sex of child in specific situation of pedestrian interaction. It indicates that how talkative you are depends on how talkative you are followed to be. Okay, next topic will be presented by Nando.
So next point we will discuss is about how language encodes gender. Uh, in this part, it is kind of pointed that biological sex is the very first thing that we notice for somebody, and this strongly suggests that we are conditioned to categorize people by sex. Uh, and this also applies to in almost all of the living being. For example, try to call somebody's baby it and just see what happens next if you were not uh, losing your life after that. Uh, and the second one is Fox belief that we have to be able to differentiate between a direct indexing and an indirect indexing. The first one is direct indexing. A linguistic feature directly indexes something with social meaning when it is categorical and exclusive. For example, using he to refer a man or using she to refer to a woman. The second one is indirect indexing. A linguistic feature indirectly indexes something with social meaning when it is not categorically associated with that meaning, but rather is linked to another meaning that is itself linked to that social meaning. For example, the word brother is directly indexes by maleness, so we can mix in different terms in a sentence. For instance, like my brother is sick, but she is getting better. Uh, that would be nonsensical and doesn't make any sense. For indirect, we can find the example in the Japanese language. Well, boys are using the suffix ze, and girls have to use wa as a suffix. In this circumstance, Ox believes that ze is directly indexing assertiveness, while wa is indexing hesitancy. Also, during a certain TV show in Japan, some of the interviewees who were women high school students explained that they couldn't compete in almost of the terms using watashi. So to balance that, they've started to use boku as the replacement for watashi so that they can compete with men in the term of competition or anything. Not only Japanese, there were also many languages that strongly affiliated language with sex or gender, like Quebec and French, for instance. Uh, and the next part would be presented by Paula.
Okay, next about gender and language change. So, the relationship between gender and class, power, place, prestige, and identity, we can find some interesting ways to add complexity to this observation. So, first off, several authors such as Strachil, Key, Expert argue that women use linguistic style shifting to position themselves with respect to social groups because That's what they have to work with. Men have better access to some ways of marking their social status, for example, jobs. So women are encouraged to be more aware of other ways of doing that, including language. This argument actually works the same way whether women are shifting towards the standard or away from it. Basically, the argument goes language is that woman is what women use to do things socially. It may also be that there are no social or economic advantage for women in sounding local. So, for example, in rural Newfoundland, there are still high paying or steady jobs in forestry, fishing, and mining available for men, but the traditional female equivalents are disappearing. Pretty well all the good jobs for women require higher education and standard English. And so it's no surprise that we find women using more standard language in the rural communities that we study. There is the argument that women favor standard forms because the standard is more closely associated with increased status or opportunities for women than it is for men. The second is women lead chains above the level of awareness, which tend to be toward higher prestige forms. But they also lead chains below the level of awareness, which are not necessarily toward higher prestige forms. This is sometimes known as the gender paradox. And maybe the women who lead one chains are not the same ones who lead another chains. A lot of our uncertainty about this actually may result from the way we variationists do things. For one thing, we usually study variables one at a time, so it's hard to see how they relate to each other, or whether the same speakers behave the same way from one variable to the next. For another, our study usually divides people into two groups on the basis of biological sex. As a result, we miss out on the reality that male or femaleness is gradient rather than absolute. In fact, studies that use even really simple gradient measures, such as asking people how female or male they consider themselves, seem to better model than frequency of use of gender identified language features than just splitting respondents into males and females. More crucially, we miss out on the fact that a study participant identified as a woman might also be a parent, a communist, a guitarist, an ASPI, and a participant in a whole pile of social networks and communities of practice, and that all those things interact and contribute to language choices. And because of that, those interactions themselves become something worth studying. Next will be presented by Nabila.
Okay, thank you, Paula. So the next is gender and class. Next. Class differences in sociolinguistic gender develop from an early age. Peter Tradko's journal, entitled Sex Covered Prestige and Linguistic Change in the Urban British English of Norwich, shows that class differences already occurred in the 20th century. The proof is in 1972, Tradko already did some research about linguistic differences through gender and class. And I'll show the table of research from Peter Tradko in the next slide. Next, the linguistic behaviors of men and the working classes are similar, but women tend to use more standard forms. Women use linguistic forms with prestige standard more frequently than men. The reason is because working class speech has favorable connotation for male speakers. Yeah, so working class have connotations of masculinity, and it is because working class associated with roughness and toughness. To a certain extent, it is considered desirable masculine attributes, and on the other hand, it is not viewed as desirable feminine attributes. The other reason is women are more status conscious than men. The social position of women in society is less secure than men. Therefore, it is necessary for women to secure and signal their social status linguistically and also in other ways. A study shows that middle class and female are sociolinguistically similar. In a book entitled Judgment and Confidence Reactions to Disadvantaged Speech, John Edwards, the author, reports a result of a study associated with this phenomenon. So there are some people in Dublin were played a recording of young boys and girls that haven't yet developed physiological differences like pitch differences, and the listeners got it wrong. They identify middle class boys as girls and working class girls as boys. Next, yeah, so here's Peter Tradkel's table research. As you can see here, it shows index scores of people in 5 different classes: middle class, lower middle class, upper working class, etc., in the 4 contextual styles that are word list style, reading passage style, and etc. From this table, we can see a distinction between gender and class in the linguistics term happened since a long time ago. So next. Okay, this section will explain by Ayu.
Okay, thank you, Nabila. I will present about identity, performance, and practice. So, as we know, gender refers to the socially constructed characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys. These include the norms, behavior, and goals associated by being a woman or man or girl or boy, as well as relationship with one another. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. In this chapter, gender has moved a lot towards considering the against behavior of the speaker, which point of view means that everyone's feelings about our gender identity result from a combination of our own background and experience and the way we relate to social expectations by challenging them or adapting them. An approach like this is useful for all aspects of our identity, but it's especially useful for gender for a number of reasons. One, one is that the social expectations associated with gender are strong and often repeated. For example, a nurse worldwide is a boy or girl on birth announcement, and of course the baby parents will know the sex or the gender of the baby so that they will know about the gender of the person with a combination of background or experience and the way we relate to social expectation. In addition, in this chapter, the author also says that the gender and other aspects in identity is closely related to each other, whereas the relate to the notion of gender identity, which is defined as a personal conception of oneself as man or female. This concept is closely related to the concept of gender roles, which are defined as outward manifestation of personality that reflect gender identity. Gender identity, uh, in almost all in almost all cases, is identity as a result of a combination of inherent and extrinsic or environment factors. Gender roles, on the other hand, are manipulated in society by observable factors such as behavior and appearance. For example, if a person considers himself male and is more and is most comfortable referring to his personal gender in masculine terms, then his gender identity is male. However, in masculine and homosexual gender in men, many people often think that masculine can be seen from the person's appearance. If he looks manly, then he will be called a masculine man. But if he looks not manly, he will not be called a masculine man. Even though his gender, even though his gender is male. Even if there is a man who was walking with his female, not female, female friends, for example, he will call gay, even though they're just a friends without any relationship. That is what causes someone to have a different view of masculine and homosexual in the man. I think that's all for me, and the next presentation will be presented by Mila.
So in the last point, we will discuss about language and sexuality. Next slide, please. There are two ways to use sociolinguistics research to say something interesting about dominant gender ideologies. First, by looking at aspects of society that have previously been taken as so natural that they're ignored. And the second one is by looking at its ages, at people and practices that don't match the dominant model. For gender, a good example of that approach is recent research on language and sexuality. Cameron and colleagues in 2003 concluded that language and sexuality analysis is really fairly constrained. The research literature doesn't interpret sexuality broadly. Of all the ways in which of being sexual, only homosexuality includes a long history of being represented as having specifically linguistic correlates. Within those constraints, however, new research on gay and lesbian language use has aided sociolinguists in illuminating a wide range of gender and identity concerns, as well as demonstrating ways that smaller-scale ethnographic research might assist us grasp what's going on. So next slide, please. So there are some examples of the research. First, Podesva in 2004 demonstrated how a single language attribute can be used to perform complicated identity work. He illustrated it through Hit, a gay male medical student tries to take the articulate meanings of the form and turn them into something precis, which fits for his diverting. Exaggerating the linguistic feature, in other words, exaggerates the sociolinguistic meaning. Then the second one is from Hall in 1995. He studied the vocabulary used by telephone sex line workers in California. These fantasy creators were competent at using language alone to depict themselves as their clientele desired, constructing heterosexual femininity through the woman's language traits defined by Lakoff. It was critical to the phone employees' effectiveness that callers believed they were speaking with a young straight female of whatever ethnicity they desired, even if the actual worker was not young, straight, of the same ethnicity, or even female in one example. And in 1995 and 1998, Barrett demonstrated the audience's understanding of what it meant to be funny, witty, or contemptuous by demonstrating how African American drag artists would use both African American and white woman speech. The audience's understanding that what they're saying is a performance has been at the basis of drag's long history in comedic theater and movies. As a result, we may use the term dragging to describe to any type of identity performance in which awareness of the fact that it is a performance is critical. And last one is Buchholz in 1998. In-depth discourse research indicates further ways in which nerd girls establish their own linguistic standards. Buchholz and her students conducted a typical quantitative analysis of intensive use of words so cool, very cool, and etc. In online forums, they discovered that nerds and geeks avoided the most gendered forms even more than their parents' generation. This implies that geeks are not merely left behind by self-described cool youth groups' language choices. Nerds, on the other hand, purposefully shift away from how those groups create genders linguistically. So I think that's all from us. Thank you for your attention.